These talks were a series of talks that I gave for the Edinburgh Sangha at the beginning of lockdown. And they were partly a response to the kind of the start of lockdown and the realization that we were probably going to be in a bit of a crisis for a while. So some of the talk might seem a little bit, well, it's very much related to that. And of course, things changed 6 months on, but I don't know. I know it's kind of quite localised at the moment, but certainly up here in Scotland, there is a sense of, well, the virus is not only not going away, but it's kind of gaining ground again, really. So a lot of cases going up again. We had 30 days of no deaths in Scotland, but that stopped now, and I think we've had 7 deaths in the last 2 days or something. So it, you know, the crisis has not gone away. So we thinking about when I was first given these talks, what came into my mind was the need for protection, and it was partly because people were talking about protection in terms of what was needed in, like, physically, what was needed to protect ourselves from this relatively unknown at that point, well, still relatively unknown, really, in a way, virus. So the talks are kind of called protection in times of crisis. I also thought of calling them love in the days of cholera, but I thought that was probably just being a bit too arty-farty, so I stuck with protectors. So we've all of us been living through this, and are living through this period of crisis in quite, probably in quite different ways. But everybody, I'm sure, has been touched by it in some way or another. Most of us, I'm sure, will have had plans affected. You know, we haven't been able to do things that we'd planned to do, and we've had to maybe do some things that we hadn't particularly planned to do. So one of the main things for me when I gave these talks initially is I should have been up the mountain leading the ordination retreat at Akashavana, rather. And instead of that, I was in my flat in Glasgow, not seeing another living being, as it were. So yeah, just I think it was quite a lesson, really, in to quote the famous Robert Burns, "The best laid plans of mice and men, gang after gley and Leah's nout, but grief for promised joy." And if you like that translated, it just says the best laid plans go all over the place, and sometimes the joy that we think we're going to get, we end up getting grief. But also, I think for many people, the grief, there's also been joy in some of the things that have arisen through living through this particular crisis. So we probably all respond in different ways. You know, certainly at the beginning of things, I know some people didn't really want to know much about it. They didn't really want to know what was happening. They kind of felt like they didn't want to look at the news. They wanted to just stay at home, close the doors, and hopefully wait till it passed. I myself, being a news junkie at the best of times, was kind of getting lots and lots and lots of input and information, watching every day's COVID virus update briefing from the First Minister here, and reading the Scottish Government website, however many pages of it. I like information. I feel safer if I've got information. Some people don't. And I think all of those responses are quite valid, really. And I'm sure all of us are quite, we'll have a different kinds of responses, but probably everybody's been frustrated and touched in some way or another. So, and we've gone through all sorts of different phases, and I think each new phase becomes a bit more complex. In some ways, it was kind of simple for a couple of months. You just stayed at home. But then once it started then you could meet this number of people, but it had to be in that condition, and you could, I think a lot of people just started finding that complexity more disconcerting than the original lockdown. And I think maybe in some ways people got more anxious almost, it seemed, because you're having to make choices. I mean, those of you who know me well might be surprised to hear, I think I became an agoraphobic introvert during those first couple of months. So when we moved from phase kind of 0 to phase 1 and 2, I started getting quite like, oh my God, who should I meet? And, you know, can I meet that person? And do I really want to meet anybody? And I don't like people anymore anyway. Which was all quite a shock to somebody that's usually like, yay, bring it on. But I think we're having to continually respond to kind of changing times, really. And that with each new phase or each new part of what we're dealing with and more information, etc., I think we need to kind of keep adjusting. And I think recently, a while back, I realised that we are never going back to business as usual. Business as usual is over. I think anybody that's clinging on to the idea that in a month or a couple of months or even in 6 months or even in a year, everything will be back to how it was before, I really don't think that's going to be the case. I don't think we're ever going back to quite where we were before. Now, in some ways, I think that's not a bad thing. I think it gives opportunities. But I think there's also a lot of grief in that. There's a lot of grief for people who are insecure about their work, insecure about their economics, etc., etc. I'm fine in a way. I've been fine and I will be fine. You know, touch wood. I might get ill, but, you know, in a way, materially, I'm kind of okay. But I know so many people who really aren't and who are really struggling. So I think we're in this strange place where we're never going back to how things were before, but we don't really yet know what a new emerging world might look like. And I think it's not too grandiose to say that I think that's quite traumatic. And I think even if people don't feel traumatized on a personal level, I think there's some sense of collective trauma that we might be tuning into a little bit here or a little bit there. And it comes in all sorts of different ways, I think. The old has gone, never coming back. The new hasn't yet emerged. Who are we? Where are we? What does the world look like? What does the new normal actually look like? I think it's one of the reasons why I found it so incredibly inspiring to be on the ordination retreat and welcome 16 women into the order. And then yesterday I did watch Buddha-Samagama, and the other guys being ordained at Padmaloka. So it's just, and I know there was a guy ordained in San Francisco a couple of weeks ago maybe, and there's 3 women from the Valencian Sangha will be ordained in a couple of weeks in Spain. So it feels a bit like, even though we don't quite know where the world's going, and even though we don't quite know what the new normal might be like, we can still go for refuge in the middle of that, and that going for refuge can still be recognised. By the way, I'm working on the assumption that this is a kind of Sangha night and people know what I'm rabbiting on about if I talk about going for refuge and such things. So if that's not the case for anybody, I do apologise, and just talk to the local order members and they'll sort you out. So I'm sure you know who they are. So when I was thinking way back about these talks, and I was thinking about how we deal with trauma or how we deal with these kind of unknown situations, I was reminded of the Serenity Prayer, which we say in 12-step groups. So grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And personally, I found that quite a sense of guidance through any circumstances where I'm not sure quite what's happening around me. I mean, it's, you know, that I hear it also in Shantideva's Bodhicharya Avatara, where he talks about the pain. You know, if you can change something, then why worry? Just change it. And if you can't change it, why worry? You can't change it. I'm paraphrasing, he didn't put it quite like that, but that was the message. So there's something about recognising what we can and can't actually affect or change. And I'm reminded very much of the second arrow in that, which I know many of you here have come through and are very involved with breathworks. And that teaching the second arrow, I know, is quite a lifeline for people. You know, it's enough to deal with the trauma, the pain, the dis-ease that one might feel, without trying to ladle, put another kind of level on top of that. And work with what it is that our responses are to those things. So also taken from 12-step groups, sometimes there are sessions where people look at themselves physically, emotionally and spiritually. So I'm not going to talk about protection in terms of the physical. I'm sure everybody's doing what they need to do with that. But I do want to say that I hope emotionally people are looking after themselves as well, and looking after their mental health, which is as important as your physical health, really. And I think one of the challenges of the kind of living through this COVID situation has been, how do people get what they need without being able to be physically in contact, perhaps, with the people that would normally be nurturing them or normally be making sure that they're kind of okay. So just on that level, please do look after each other. And I think one of the things that happens as time goes on, it's harder to kind of remember, really, in a way, because in another way it does become a bit normalised. But do look out for each other. So I'm going to look at spiritual protection, and I've managed to talk for quite a long time without even mentioning Avalokitesvara. I'm getting there, honest. So these protectors are the three protectors from the end of the puja, the mantras that we chant at the end of the puja. So they're the family protectors. They're known as they're known as the family protectors. So the Avalokitesvara, Manjughosha or Manjushri, and Vajrapani. And they represent between them, in a way, the whole human being. So Avalokitesvara, you could say, is more of the emotional, the kind of heart, the compassion aspect. Manjughosha is the wisdom aspect, so perhaps can be seen as the more cognitive, the more kind of head, to put it like that. And Vajrapani is energy, so is more to do with volition. So you've got head, heart and guts, really. And tonight we're starting with the heart. So I'm going to put up an image now of Avalokitesvara for us to have a little look at. So this is Avalokitesvara. There's lots of different forms of Avalokitesvara with different numbers of arms, as it were, and different iconography. This one is the four-armed Avalokitesvara, and this is the meditation practice that I've actually done for the 40 years that I've been ordained. So I want to point out different things in the iconography of this figure, but first of all, just kind of take it in, I guess. So he is the Bodhisattva of Compassion. And you could say that Avalokitesvara is the archetypal Bodhisattva, because all Bodhisattvas arise from compassion. And Avalokitesvara is the embodiment, the archetype of compassion. So I remember talking to Sangha, talking to Bhante during my ordination, and telling him this was the figure that I wanted to meditate on. And he said then, well, that he is, for somebody for whom the Bodhisattva ideal is important, he is the archetypal Bodhisattva. So the first thing I want to talk about really is the fact that he's seated in meditation posture. He's a meditator. We often think of compassion as being very active and doing and kind of out there helping in a certain way. And of course, all of that does come into relationship with compassion. But he's a yogic compassion. He's a meditator. And it's very important to realise that the basis of our compassion must be insight, that we can't separate wisdom and compassion. And the wisdom aspect I'll say more about when I talk about Manjughosha, but they're very, very intertwined. If you remember the Heart Sutra, which is the very heart of the wisdom sutras, begins by the Bodhisattva of Compassion. So it's actually Avalokitesvara who's telling us about the emptiness and the wisdom of the Heart Sutra. So they're very conjoined. So Avalokitesvara holds just there, sort of looks like a blue ball in this particular image, but it's actually a jewel. It's the wish-fulfilling gem. So he holds it in his hands at his heart. So this is really the bodhicitta, but it's known as it's the Chintamani, which is translated as the wish-fulfilling gem. So what is the wish? What is the wish that this gem will fulfill? Well, if we go right back to the time of the Buddha's great wish was that all beings would understand the true nature of existence. The Buddha taught that true compassion is wishing that all beings will be free of dukkha, free of suffering. So there's levels of suffering, and there's some levels of suffering that we can never be free from. The fact that we're born into a human body means that there is a level of suffering which is more or less inevitable. Most people don't make it from birth to death over a long and healthy life with absolutely no suffering whatsoever. In fact, I have never yet met any of them. Maybe they exist, but most people I know, even if it's, not huge cataclysmic suffering, something in their life will be unsatisfactory. And in fact, most of us end up coming into relationship with the Dharma because there is something unsatisfactory in our life. It might be major, it might be just a sense that there ought to be more, there must be more. So we can't necessarily be free of suffering, but we can be free of responses that are not helpful to suffering. So one of the things about not getting caught up in the second arrow is to recognise and start to catch the stories that we tell ourselves when we're faced with suffering. So, for example, if something happens that we don't like, do we look for somebody to blame it on? Or do we turn it in and blame it on ourselves? They seem to be the two major kind of ways forward. And of course, there's a middle way to that, which is that maybe we're responsible in some sense, but at the same time, life happens. So the Buddha taught that there is a path to the end of suffering, that there's a path to freedom. And he taught that the way to do that is to recognize the cause of suffering. And the cause of suffering is desire. The cause of suffering is our wish to make things different from how they actually are, to either have more of the things that will make us feel better or push away the things that we think will threaten our well-being. So it's, that's normal. It's a normal human response to the world, to life, etc. My own second arrow tends to be anger. So my own default position in terms of a negative mental state, when things do not go as I would like them to go, I get really pissed off. I get really angry. And it's not even anger at anybody or anything in particular. It's just a kind of at the world, like, why is it like this? And I could feel that happening when we were having to make the decisions about the ordination retreats and whether we were going to have to cancel the 3-month retreat at Akashavana or not. And I found myself spending a long time trying to work out alternatives, which to some extent was helpful because it's good to look at alternatives, but there was also a level in it which was just me trying to control the entire universe and make it do what I wanted it to do and not being very happy when in fact I couldn't do it. So we'll all have our own responses. Maybe some of us get depressed or get a bit low when things aren't going how we'd like them to go. Some of us will get angry. Some of us maybe are just more phlegmatic and better able to just go, well, whatever. But I aspire to that, but work in progress. So the Buddha taught that by recognizing this desire for things to be different, that we can actually not necessarily get rid of all suffering, but we can stop putting layers on top of that suffering. So it's easy to lose perspective sometimes when we're faced with dukkha. I'm sorry if this talk's a bit gloomy doomy, but it was crisis, it was protection in times of crisis. So I can give happy jolly talks as well, but tonight's is more to do with suffering really. So one thing that I think became very obvious to me as well with this was that it's important not to jump too quickly to action. My tendency is to come up with a strategy very immediately and to sort it all out. And I can see Tara Vanden has got a wee smile on her face there, because she knows me quite well in this area, and she knows my Myers-Briggs type, and she knows that I'm a field marshal. So my tendency in facing any crisis is to look for the strategic way out of it. And I've had to learn over the years that sometimes we can't really do that too quickly, that it's important to sometimes just sit a little bit. Just sit with whatever we're feeling before we jump to action. So Avalokitesvara for me, as well as being the Bodhisattva of Compassion, it is a Bodhisattva of stillness. For me, one of the important things I've had to learn about my relationship with this Bodhisattva is that to really be able to act with true compassion, and not to just clamour when I see or hear suffering, whether it's my own or others, is just to be able and willing to sit in the stillness. So I want to share a couple of things that I find inspiring around that sense of stillness. So I'm going to read to you a little quote from one of my favourite books, which I don't know if you can see that. It's The Spirit of the Quakers. So I think if I wasn't a Buddhist, I might be a Quaker. I have a lot of time for Quakers. And I really love the sense that they have of really going into stillness and into a kind of real deep inner knowledge before even speaking, let alone before acting. So this is, it's from somebody called John Edward Southall, who was one of the very early Quakers. And I find this really, really inspiring. I began to get still, but I had no more commenced than a perfect pandemonium of voices reached my ears. 1,000 clamouring notes from without and within, until I could hear nothing but their noise and din. Some of them were my own voice, some were my own questions, some my very prayers. Others were the voices of the world's turmoil. Never before did there seem to be so many things to be done, to be said, to be thought. In every direction I was pushed and pulled and greeted with the noisy acclamation of unspeakable unrest. It seemed necessary to listen and to answer and to act, but God said, "Be still and know that I am God." Then came the conflict of thoughts for the morrow and its duty and its cares, but God said, "Be still." And as I listened and slowly learnt to obey, I shut my ears to every sound. I found after a while that when the other voices ceased, there was a still, small voice in the depths of my being that began to speak with inexpressible tenderness, power, and comfort. So I hope you don't mind too much the references to God. Obviously, we might translate that differently and think of it more in terms of some transcendent power, the Bodhisattvas, Avalokitesvara himself. But it's interesting because Avalokitesvara is the Lord who listens. He's the Lord who hears. That's one of the translations of his name. And so it's interesting because for myself, before I got ordained, I never thought to ask for a practice around this figure because he seemed a bit white and wishy-washy. Because we used to chant the mantra. I mean, some of you remember, oh my God, it was a dirge. You know, we used to chant the mantra like this. Om Mani Padme Hum. So, you know, and I never in a month of Sundays would have thought that this was a figure that would attract me. I was all for Padmasambhava or whatever. But actually, I had this experience on a solitary retreat where I actually had this sense of hearing the clamouring of the world, hearing the kind of suffering of the world. And the only response to it was this stillness that was Avalokitesvara. So, you know, that little passage speaks to me of the need to find the small, still, silent voice that allows me then to respond with tenderness but also with power and wisdom. And I'd also like to share a Wendell Berry poem with you, which many of you will probably know. It's often read on retreats. When despair grows in me, and I wake in the night, at the least sound and fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars, waiting for the light. For a time I rest in the grace of the world, and I am free. So again, that sense of finding a way to find an inner stillness that can refresh us, find our own inner stream of refreshing water. But then, is that enough? How do we engage beyond that? And I sometimes think Buddhists find a dichotomy between contemplation and action. So when I was a child, when I was about 12 years old, I wanted to be a Catholic nun. And I had two aunties who were Catholic nuns. One of them was a contemplative nun. She was a Benedictine nun, and she lived in a closed convent in Glasgow. And we could only see her like twice a year or something, at Christmas and Easter, behind the grill. So I used to love this. I used to have these fantasies when I was 12 of being behind the grill. I thought it sounded great, everybody swishing about in their habits and kind of praying and still. But my other auntie, well, they were cousins really, but they were old. My other auntie was a missionary in Africa, and she was a medical missionary because she trained as a GP. And she used to come and tell us these stories of all these things that she'd seen and these people that she'd saved their lives. And I thought, yeah, I want to do that. And I used to lie in my bed at night and think, which of these two kinds of nuns should I be? The musings of a 12-year-old. Anyway, I was very delighted. I didn't believe in God. That was my problem about being a nun. But years later, when I came across Buddhism, I was greatly relieved to discover you didn't have to choose between these two ways of being, and that in fact they feed each other, that our action can be fed by our contemplation, and our contemplation will go deeper to the extent that we engage with the world. Because I believe that both are needed. So going back to the iconography here, because I realise I've already talked for a rather while. So in his right hand there, Avalokitesvara holds a mala, a set of rosaries, as it were. And this represents the beings that he will save. But for me, it also represents prayer in a sense. It doesn't traditionally necessarily represent that, but it does for me. Because I do believe that those who choose a contemplative life can do it not just for their own good, but can actually be doing it with a belief. I know my auntie definitely believed that her prayers were intercessions for the suffering of the world. So I quite like to think about that. I do believe that meditation and contemplation has an effect beyond just calming the mind. So we can go deeper. The more we actually allow ourselves to become immersed in our contemplation, the more we can act appropriately and act in the ways that will actually alleviate suffering. So I just want to talk very briefly about different levels of compassion. So the first level of compassion is when we're full of metta, we're full of love for humans, for beings, all beings, and we see suffering, and our immediate response is karuna. Our immediate response is compassion. We want to act to alleviate that suffering, and it comes from a heart full of loving kindness. And that's a wonderful level of compassion. And if we could all really be living from that level of compassion, the world would be a much better place. But there's a deeper level of compassion where we actually, through wisdom, realize that how suffering arises. We don't just react and respond when we see suffering. We're much more able to be part of the arising and passing of conditionality. And we have a deep understanding of the true nature of existence, which means that we see how suffering is created. We see through that sense of separateness of self and other, and realize that suffering arises when we do not live in harmony with how reality actually is. And we see that myself and others seek happiness and its causes. And yet, again and again and again, I, like everybody else, create the conditions for present and future suffering. What a pity. And that sense of compassion arises when we recognize there's no blame, there's no polarization between people being hurt, people causing hurt. There's just a strong sense of the arising and the passing of conditions. And we recognize that polarization is a very deep-rooted human thing, and it arises often from fear of the unknown, fear of what might attack us, a need to protect what we have. Protection in a completely different sense. Protection in the sense of holding to us what shores up our identity and pushing away anything that threatens our identity. And in this sense of compassion, we recognize the interconnectedness of all beings. And I think you can see this with this virus, you know. You can see with this virus how interconnected we all are, even in a physical sense, how easy it is to be connected. But also the response of kindness that has also come, that has arisen, the response of people wanting to move out into their community, support and help each other has been deeply, deeply inspiring. So in the other hand, he has a lotus, and this lotus represents the possibility of growth. The lotus arises from the mud, from the dirt, and yet it arises and it's beautiful. And this is a lovely symbol for spiritual growth. No matter where we start, no matter what conditions we have, no matter what conditioning we have, we can overcome that and really see our true potential. So that jewel that's at his heart is also found deep in that lotus. The jewel in the lotus, which is Avalokitesvara's mantra, which I'll come to in a minute to finish. So that jewel is the deep inner longing for freedom, freedom from suffering, freedom from dukkha, freedom not just for me, but freedom for all of us. So that's what Avalokitesvara represents, a deep, still, contemplative, arising of wisdom, a recognition of the non-separateness of all beings, and a desire to move towards beings, to alleviate suffering in whatever way we can. And we can trust that compassion will arise from wisdom. We can really trust that from that deep contemplative insight, action will arise. And symbolically, we know that from the story of the birth of Tara, that through the tears that came from Avalokitesvara, when he looked around and saw the depth of suffering in the world, and he wept and he wept and he wept, and a lake arose from his tears. And there in the middle of the lake, a lotus opened, a blue lotus opened, and sitting on top of that lotus was the beautiful figure of Tara, of green Tara. And green Tara, born from the tears of compassion, has one foot ready to step into the world. So we can trust that that will be the case. We can trust that our compassion, arising from our contemplative insight, will move into the world to alleviate suffering. And the way that moves is also symbolically seen in the mantra. And I wanted to just share the mantra with you. So this is a depictation of Avalokitesvara's mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum. And this represents compassion moving out into the world. So in the meditation of Avalokitesvara, we send that compassion out into the world. It's purified by Amitabha's love, and it goes out into the world in the form of the mantra. And each of those syllables of the mantra land, as it were, in a particular realm of existence. So if you're familiar with the 6 realms from the Wheel of Life, each one of these syllables manifests as a Buddha, Bodhisattva in each of the different realms, and it gives to that realm what's needed for the alleviation of suffering. So what that says is that it's appropriateness. Compassion needs to be appropriate. Compassion is more about the receiver than it is about the giver. You know, it's more about really listening and hearing what's actually needed so that we can then move towards. So the Om, the white Om, arrives into the world of the gods, the Devas, and that figure holds a lute and plays the melody of impermanence to remind, even when we're in the God realm, that everything can change. Ma takes place into the Ashura realm, and it brings the sword of wisdom. And I always think that sword cuts through polarization, because polarization is rife in the Ashuras. The Ashura realm of politics, of, well, the world in that very, very deeply competitive sense. So the wisdom sword cuts through polarization. The yellow knee comes to the human realm and carries a begging bowl, which represents the possibility of, within the human realm, finding a spiritual life. The Pa goes to the animal realm, and that can be animals, or it can be us when we're in a less than human state. And in that, the Buddha or Bodhisattva gives a book to represent education. In other words, to represent a rising of consciousness, a lifting of consciousness. And the May, the red Dme, goes to the realm of the Pretas. Now, the Pretas are the hungry ghosts. So this is the realm of addiction, actually, and it's the realm of things never being quite right and never actually being able to give us what we need. And what the Buddha gives there is food and drink that can actually be digested. So again, appropriateness. In that realm, the Buddha gives what's needed. And the last syllable is the blue-black hung. And that goes into the hell realms, and it takes nectar, because when we're in a hell realm, we need soothing. And the hell realm can be anger, it can be despair, it can be many of the things that arise when we think of the issues of the world. Not just COVID, but climate crisis, whatever things it is that particularly affect us, suffering, poverty, prejudice, all the things that we can see that cause suffering. Our response sometimes is to go into a hell realm. And so the nectar is the soothing. So the mantra soothes beings in hell. So there you go, there you have it. There's an introduction to the Bodhisattva of Compassion, Avalokitesvara. It was probably longer than it should have been. Sorry, get a bit carried away. So I hope that there's something in that, you know, maybe you can find some protection in that. Protection from negative mental states, protection from the kind of responses where we might feel insecure, uncertain, and just really acknowledging that there is a crisis in the world. So thank you.